And a standard tiger opening that both of them will know very well. Lee obviously didn't eat enough lunch, and he's dropping chocolate all over the board. So why would a player sit back in the way that Song is now sitting back and think at this point in the game? Both of the players know this position really, really well. The reason is because they will know various lines from here that they would both play. And what he'll be thinking about is which of those various lines maybe Lee doesn't know as well, or and so once they've decided which line they're going to play, they'll take it a few more moves as they have done, and then they'll settle down, and they will still know this position, but again, it's another position where Song has stopped and is thinking, what line am I going to play? So as I mentioned in the previous game when Song was playing Pinatanchulu from Thailand, Song likes to take a big block and force his opponent's play through. And this opening allows him to do that as well. He's got the big block down at the bottom of the board as we look at it in the live Othello screen in the bottom left. And he is he is going to be playing again in such a way that he wants White's wall at the top to remain whilst White plays through. But this is actually a two-wall game, or two blocks, because it's fairly symmetrical, and White is in a very similar position. So Lee is also in a position where he has a block at the top of the board, and he's hoping to be the one who forces Black to play through. But at this point, they would both still be in book. They would both still know this position as an opening. So there is no immediate advantage to either player here. The reason that Lee would stop and think at this point is because the left-hand edge looks like it's going to be played out, and he's deciding what's the best way to play it out, and he probably knows several lines for playing it out and thinks, what sort of game do I want, and starts to play in that way. And is so often the case with Yan Song. He seems to have a patience that surpasses anything I've seen before in Othello, where when he wants someone to play through, he doesn't rush into taking edges when other people would. He doesn't get scared. He calmly looks it out, thinks about the degree of what he needs to give up to be able to force his opponent to play through, and then he gives it up. And it, to me and other people, it can look really, really scary, because it looks like, as in the last game, he was running out of moves, but he carefully looked through what he needed to give up to get his opponent to play through, and then played it out when he did. So in this case, White has been the first one to take an edge, and as I said previously, that doesn't surprise me, because Yan Song is very good at waiting and being patient. So what White is trying to do now is, what Black would like to do is sacrifice at the bottom left at some point later in the game. But the way the discs are at the moment doesn't really allow him to do that. There's no way. He would have to play out a substantial line in the bottom of the board before he can sacrifice. So if white can keep the game moving so that black doesn't get the opportunity to do that, and forces black to play up towards the top, then black doesn't make the sacrifice that he wants to make. So Yan Song is trying to pull white Li down to the bottom of the board eventually, because if he pulls him down there and white plays through towards the bottom of the board, then black can play out the bottom of the board and possibly make the sacrifice at b7. But that's thinking strategically rather than tactically, and by that I mean I'm not thinking of any lines that lead to that specifically, but just the general idea. And so white, as I said, is really thinking about how he can keep playing to keep making black play towards the top of the board. It's a very tight position at the moment, because if white has to play through at the bottom, then he's going to struggle. And we've already seen that that's what Yan Song is very good at making his opponent do. Now, normally, edges on opposite sides of the board are bad, because they get in the way of a lot of moves. It will be very difficult to play towards the bottom without flipping to the left and to the right, and flipping lots of ugly discs that will give black a lot of safe moves. So normally h2 would be a bad move, but given the strategy of wanting to pull black towards the top of the board and keep black playing towards the top of the board, and black doesn't have good moves at the top of the board at the moment, so h2 is not as bad as it might otherwise be, but it relies on the strategy working out in the end. White could also do h6 before taking the edge. There's sometimes advantages to doing that kind of thing, and I'm just trying to think through whether there is an advantage in this case or not. But although it's possible that those players are now out of book, they will both have been in similar positions from playing these openings before. And so they will know a general strategy that they are trying to use to get towards the end of the game. But this is the first time I think that Li has sat back and is seriously considering what's happening, and he's thinking about whether to take h2 now or not, because it's ugly, it sticks out, it's uneven, it gives black potential opportunities later in the game, but only if white plays through the bottom. Then okay, so he's gone for the h6 option first. Now, as I say, I'm not sure whether there's an advantage to doing this or not. He doesn't have access to h5, so he can't give away that edge by taking two moves to black's one. If black plays in h5, then white can take the edge, and it's not quite as ugly as a free sticking out, but given the strategy requires black to always be playing to the north, it doesn't actually make that much difference whether he'd taken h2 before h6 or not. Now, here's a common mistake that some people make when they first start playing Othello and learning how to play edges. If black does g6 now, it looks like white might go h5 and then black can take the edge. However, if black does go to g6, white can then take h2. Black doesn't have access to h5, so white can then later on take h5. And because g6 is now also black, white then also gets h7. And this sequence can often prove fatal because what's happening is black will take one move, and then white would take 1, 2, 3 moves for that one, and take a stable edge in the process. And black has to play 2 other moves elsewhere in the meantime. And now if you imagine black playing 2 other moves, maybe at the top of the board, he's going to get into a very, very, very weak position. Neither of these 2 players would make that mistake, but nevertheless it's an interesting thing to see. It probably has a name, but I don't know it. Maybe edge trap, don't know. So as I say, the strategy here is for, as was the case at the beginning of the game, there's a white block and wall at the top and a black block and wall at the bottom, and whoever gets the other person to play through has the advantage. Okay, so black has had to play through. And as I say, this is white's strategy. His left edge isn't going to do him any harm so long as black keeps having to play up towards the north. And if white can play out the north edge in such a way that he doesn't give a black another edge to sacrifice against, but does manage to keep the moves even, and if he takes the edge and there's no sacrifice against it, then black's going to struggle to find any moves. He always has c7, but it's not obvious that that works out well. It gets him a move, but thinking strategically, it would be possible at some point, possibly for white to take. The x square. So you'll notice that Lee thought for a good 8 minutes or so, just a few moves ago. And since then, he's been making his moves fairly quickly. So the line he played out, he knew what he was going to play in response to any of Song's moves. And Song has chosen to play out a couple of moves at the top and then offer the right edge to white. And again, as I said, this is something that Song does incredibly well. If white chooses to take that edge, he may do it because he feels that he can run black out of moves, leaving black no good moves. And it's certainly possible. But at the same time, if he takes that edge and black doesn't run out of moves and white plays through the bottom, then all of white's moves become bad, and black suddenly takes huge control. So this requires careful thought. Can he take the edge and run black out of moves? Or does he need to do something else? And can he afford to let black take the edge? Is another consideration. He does have some quiet moves as white. White has some quiet moves down to the bottom now because the right-hand edge is black. Except for the h6 disc. White can play d7 without flipping diagonally. He can also play if he does play d7, then if white does play d7, then black can play e7 and white can then play c7. So you will see that if that's the case, black has still got the most right-hand disc, so if he ever tries to sacrifice, he will give at b7 he will give away a swindle. So white has declined to take the edge, but has continued trying to pull to the north. So he's not given up on his strategy. He's not saying I don't trust my strategy. But what he is saying is I'm willing to allow black to take the right hand edge if he wants it. But if he doesn't, then I'm going to play out the top, play some moves at the top of the board first, and then h2 becomes much more powerful because we've shared moves elsewhere. If I can make the top of the board less playable for black and then take h2, is what white's thinking. And so now it's black's turn to think about whether to take the edge or not. You'll notice that if black does take the edge, as it stands, white doesn't have a good sacrifice at the top. But there's an interesting position also developing with the f3 c6 diagonal for white. So that's currently all white. And if white gets to play d1, then it's not impossible that diagonal could stay white and become a very crucial diagonal later in the game, because if white makes that diagonal such that black can't flip on it, then when black plays c7, which is his only move down into the south, not including taking the edge, then white can play b7 and will keep that diagonal. So one of the things that black will be thinking at the moment is how can I make sure that I can cut that diagonal should I need to. And another way would be to cut it in the middle, but that kind of demonstrates the difficulty, because if you look at the discs of e4 and d5, there's really no way to actually flip those except by along the diagonal if you have a different disc on that diagonal. So black isn't able to flip those middle discs, and if he flips the edge ones at the wrong time, then white can just take the x squares. The x squares, the ones being diagonally in from the corner, and keep hold of that diagonal. So Song has chosen to play f1. Followed by f2 by Lee. So the strategy is still playing out as we discussed earlier. White managed to get black to play through. White is now trying to play out the top edge so that black doesn't get a spare move. White doesn't want to be the first one to play through on the bottom. Although, so long as he doesn't take the H column, the right edge, then playing out at the bottom doesn't look too bad at the moment because of D7, E7, C7 sequence. So long as B3 stays black, would always allow B7 as a sacrifice. Okay. So C1 from Yan Song. So white. Oh, this is interesting. If white needs to choose whether to wedge, but if he wedges by playing D1, then the top left corner is an odd region. So if black can play out the rest of the board, then he gets parity in the rest of the board, and white doesn't really want to give up parity. However, white could also take G1. But if he does that, there's a stoner trap, another stoner trap, similar to one in Yan Song's last game. So after G1, B2 is a stoner trap, and just to reiterate what a stoner trap is, if you imagine white taking G1 and black playing in B2, the whole of the B2 to F6 diagonal is black, so white can't take the corner immediately. And then on white's next move, on black's next move, he would play D1, which would threaten to take the H1 corner. And the only way that white would be able to stop it would be to play B1, but then he would flip B2, giving white both the A1 and the H1 corners. So G1 is a move that would be considered but dismissed fairly quickly. The wedge has its own problems, but by the wedge I mean D1. But it looks quite scary for black still, in some ways, just because the F3 to C6 diagonal looks a lot stronger. It can be cut by B1, and I'm sure that this is probably what Yang Song is thinking. So if white does take the D1 wedge, maybe not immediately, but when black plays potentially B1 followed by A1 followed by B2, black does cut the diagonal but gives away an awful lot of discs along the left edge and the top edge. But as we've seen again in Yan Song's last game, he's prepared to give up a lot of discs if he knows that what he gets in return fits in with the strategy that he's trying to play, and the one that he thinks is going to win. So G1 isn't really an option. D1 is an option, but it kind of commits the rest of the game to follow a certain pattern, and if Lee believes that that pattern is going to win, or that the strength of the diagonal, and he's not going to, the amount of discs he can get in the top left as Yan Song plays it out is going to be enough, then that's a consideration. But there's also other moves available. If he plays other moves, then he's going to say to Yan Song, well, you can take the top edge by playing D1, and potentially have G1 as a spare move, a tempo that you can play whenever you like. And Lee would have to play two moves. He would have to play now, allow D1, and then play a second move and allow G1. And as you can imagine, white playing two moves in this position is going to flip a lot of pieces, and black doesn't have to take his tempo immediately either. So Lee has taken the edge instead. So he's taken the edge and offered the top edge to Yan Song. Now if white has to play down towards the bottom of the board at all, it's going to end very badly. Imagine any of C7, D7, E7, F7, G6 being played, or G7. There's immediate responses everywhere. So Jan has chosen to take the edge, which seemed like the only option. Now, in this position, white doesn't really want to allow black to take G1 as well. So he's probably going to sacrifice at G2, which he has done. So he's still got that diagonal, which is looking increasingly difficult to cut. So C7 could be met with B7. It's not clear what happens after that. And so Yan Song has sacrificed in okay. So Yan Song's kind of saying, I'm willing to give up pieces in the top left corner and the top edge and the bottom edge to force white to play through at the bottom and take all my nice moves down there. And this looks like a strategy it has been his strategy from the beginning, and it's also allowed him to cut that difficult diagonal, even though white could still make it difficult for him. It's looking like a good strategy for black. So if white, for example, takes A1, black plays B1, and white does get the whole of the top edge, a lot of the top edge and a lot of the left edge, some stable discs, but nothing of white's other moves. So it would go white, black, A1, B1. If white then goes to G1, then black can go to H1. So that's not really gaining anything. And all of white's moves down the bottom of the board are bad. But that's what he's going to do anyway. So he's going to try and grab discs. And Yan Song seems to be playing confidently now. So white doesn't have access to B1. He can get access, but if he plays B1 or G1, then black just plays the other. It saves a lot of discs, and white then has to take his big, ugly moves down the bottom of the board. The only not ugly move down the bottom of the board is probably E8, but it allows immediate response of D8, and then it becomes ugly response if he takes the edge anyway. So black will try and play out the bottom of the board without taking the right edge, but he's always got the move to H7 should he need it as well. This is distinctly looking like a black win now. So white has taken the edge, and as I said, it's really a pair, so whichever one that Lee played, Song would play the other. Not that Lee had access to B1 at the time, but he could have got it. And so again we see Yan Song's strategy of building that block down to the bottom of the board, sacrificing a corner and an edge. In this case he's got his own corner and edge as well, and white has to play bad moves now. There is no good moves for white. And especially because white still has that right-hand edge. It's poisoning everything. Everywhere he can play now. Just flips in lots of directions and gives black immediately good responses. And so what Lee will be thinking at this point is he will feel that the game is lost. His instincts and his superficial reading of the board will tell him that the game is lost. However, he will be thinking to himself, is there anything unusual that can happen here? He'll be trying to find that unique move that throws in a difficulty that neither player has thought about until this moment, but it's not clear that in this case there's anything that really exists. So far in this tournament, Wan Song, who was a semi-finalist a few years ago, is looking strong. It's not a nice feeling when you know that you're almost certainly going to lose, and you want to find something good, you don't think it exists, and eventually you have to play a disc, and you don't really want to play that disc, but you have to do it. And that's the feeling that Lee is probably going through at this moment. Still hoping for, there's still moves on the board, strange things do happen, which makes the game interesting. But in his heart, he probably doesn't think it's going to happen in this case. But it is a sign of a good player who, just because they can't see the winning line, just because they can see lots of losing lines, he hasn't kind of just shrugged and stopped thinking. He's still saying to himself, maybe I can find something, maybe I can find something. He'll see some things that cause difficulties and just ask himself the question, can I make something of that? So he's using his time to try and find something that, in this case, probably doesn't exist. And I'm wondering if when he actually makes his next move, whether there will be any... Yeah, the body language kind of says the game's over. But Wan Song, on the other hand, is is very aware that sometimes you can be in positions that you think, I'm winning, I'm going to win, and you can relax too much, and it's possible to make a mistake, miss a complication, one that you'd even thought about previously, and so he's not going to rush it. He's going to look at his available responses, and it looks here as though there's probably several moves that are winning. And so maybe he's just thinking, if he is actually confident that he's going to win, then maybe he's thinking about maximising his discs. G6 is an interesting move now and that's what he's played. Because white doesn't have access to H7, so black's going to get that move as well, which gives a nice number of internal discs. Internal discs are strong at this point in the game because as long as you don't have to play out in a line where there's two spaces, then they're going to remain by the end of the game. White will probably now just try and play out parity. It's almost certainly not going to be enough. It won't be enough. But C8 would create the region in the bottom left of 4 spaces. Because white goes second in the game, they tend to get the last move in the game, and so trying to create even spaces can save discs because you get the last move in every region. Lee down to 7 minutes on his clock. Yeah, so white is just trying to play out parity, and it won't be enough, but he hasn't really got anything else to try. Now, it was in Mito World Championships in 2016 when Yan Song got to the final, and I think Lee was in the semi-finals, and Lee was in the semi-finals as well that year. And Yan Song had a very, very strong tournament, but his semi-final game, I believe it was against Pianatanchili, but I could be wrong on that. But it was his his semi-final game. He wasn't pleased with at all, and he lost. A bug just crawling across the table there. And Lee catching it under a cup. A little bit of amusement, but fortunately not at a crucial moment in the game. Wan Song now just really thinking about how he can maximise his discs. And the reason that's important is because later on in the tournament, if there's two players equal on score and they need to be separated for some reason, for example, getting into the semi-finals, discs is one of the factors that plays a part. Another factor is the strength of your opponents. Both players just playing this out now. Okay, this is an interesting thing for, as been mentioned, getting the last move in every region is good. At the moment, until A7, the bottom left region was even, so white would be able to go, black would have to play their first, so it would go black, white, black, white. But what Wan Song has done has played into that region in such a way that white has to take two moves. He has to take the A8 move and he has to take the B7 move. And the reason that that's the case is because black can play out the odd region in the bottom right. So black played A7, white took A8, black plays out the three moves in the bottom right, and then white has to play again. Look at the size of black's move on the last move and understand why it's important to get the last move in each region, and consider what's worth giving up to be able to do that. So another nice game from Wan Song there. He's looking very, very strong, and looks like he could go a long way in this tournament. And we'll see you later for the next round.